Good afternoon to everybody. Dear Lady Ashton, ambassadors, representatives of the diplomatic corps in Warsaw, dear guests and viewers, dear students, dear colleagues. Today we have the great honor and pleasure of hosting in Natolin at the College of Europe, Lady Ashton, who is visiting Poland in connection with the publication of her political memoir. Our guest has had a long and very diverse political career. I might say interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, referring to the name of our program here, European Interdisciplinary Studies Program. Consequently, Lady Ashton is for Natolin students and the whole College of Europe community at the same time a guest and a lecturer, proving with her own professional biography that in the 21st century politicians can still deal with different areas of politics with success. Lady Ashton was involved in public affairs of her country as early as the 1980s. Her dedication to public affairs led her through different roles and positions, as she became a member of the House of Lords for the Labour Party, only to later serve in leadership roles in the Ministries of Education and Justice, and ultimately to head the House of Lords. For several years, our guest is also the Chancellor of the University of Warwick. However, for those who are interested in EU affairs, the most important moment was in 2008, when our dear guest became the first woman EU Trade Commissioner, and after a year, the first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the Vice President of the European Commission. In this demanding double role, her first strategic task was to build up the European External Action Service. At the same time, she was involved in dealing with many international crises, two of her landmarks being the normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo, as well as negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Let us also not forget her involvement in the early days of the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine some 10 years ago, something which now clearly resonates at the times of the Russian full-scale war against Ukraine. Catherine Ashton was ending her EU mission highly appreciated, not only by supporters or neutral observers, but also by initial critics. It also strikes me that what Lady Ashton left with her achievements, and above all with her modesty, discretion, efficiency in negotiations, stands out as the best possible testimony to the direct British role in the European Union before Brexit. Dear Lady Ashton, we are truly privileged by your visit to the College of Europe in Natolin. The floor is yours.
Vice-Rector, my dear friend Thomas, most importantly of all students, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today. It's long been a desire of mine to come to this university and to have the opportunity to talk with you. So please don't disappoint me. When I finish my remarks, I really want your questions. There's nothing you can't ask. I may not be able to answer it, but I will certainly try. And I wanted to give you some thoughts from my experiences, thinking especially about the long term, because one of the lessons I try to draw out in my book is that we need to think much longer term about how we're going to tackle crises, deal with problems before they become a crisis, and how our diplomacy and our international relations should develop in the future. And I'm going to begin by telling you a story that's in the book, a very short story, about a visit I made to China. When I had a chance to travel inside countries I visited and understand more about them, I would take that opportunity. And I went to visit, as you will do if you go to China, I hope, the terracotta warriors, to go and see the site where they believe the first emperor of China is buried. And I met the senior archaeologist who was in charge of the site. And she took me to walk amongst the warriors. And she said, you know, this is only the outside of everything that we know is still buried. There are many treasures to be found in the other parts. And I said, well, where do you think the main part, the main chamber where the emperor is buried is? And she pointed to a small hill in the distance and said, we think it's there. And I said, well, when will you begin to excavate? When will you archaeologists go and look for things? And she said, maybe in about 50 years. The point of the story was she was thinking about something that she would have no part in because she would be retired, at least, if she was still with us, but something that she was able to think about in a long-term perspective. I'm not telling you the story to say that China always thinks long-term. I know that's something that's often said, but it did strike me that in her case, she was prepared to take a long view. And I thought about that when I was thinking about the problems and the issues that I dealt with or tried to help when I was High Representative. And it occurred to me that we seem to think that problems that take decades to appear, challenges that often bubble up over time, that somehow we can resolve them or deal with them in days, weeks, months, or even just a few years. Why do we think that one generation of girls going to school is enough to change a society? Why do we think that investing for the short term is going to develop our perspectives, is going to be able to resolve the problems in the longer term? So I consider that one of the key lessons I learned is that we have to think longer term and to be prepared to invest in that long term. And that's not easy because it means investing resources and energy and time into a problem that may feel like it's not going to be easily resolved. One of the first challenges I faced when I was appointed was to go to Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake of 2010. You may not remember it, but it was a devastating earthquake. 235,000 people died in 35 seconds. It destroyed Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. 95% of some areas were destroyed. When I flew over them in a helicopter, I couldn't find the 5% that survived. It was terrible, but it was terrible in a country that was already suffering from decades of poverty and violence and political insecurity, a problem that still exists today. If you read about Haiti today, you will see that gang violence is on the rise, that there are no politicians able to take the country into the future. And back in 2010, there had been support given to Haiti for over 50 years. The first mission went in 1955. And I met people from the UN who were trying extremely hard to support this country. Many of the UN staff that had been working with Haiti had died in the earthquake, so here were new people coming in to try and support them. But when you looked at the problems, some of them were, in my view, capable of finding solutions if we thought longer term. And my example was always a mango chutney factory. Haiti produces some of the best mangoes in the world, but they don't travel very well. They don't last very long. So I said, well, what we need is a mango chutney factory. And the reason I said that was not because I thought we would build a mango chutney factory, but I was trying to make the point that sometimes thinking longer term means thinking more broadly about what is possible to do that can provide opportunities beyond the immediate. In Haiti at that point, 65% of the people elected to Parliament, well, this was the first time they'd ever had a salary, ever had a regular job. 65%. So in a country where people were coming into positions in Parliament without the knowledge and experience of even being able to look back on a career at work, it's hard to imagine that they would have the understanding or indeed the expertise to be able to develop what I called my mango chutney factory. The point about it was, if you build something like that, you have to build the roads. You have to have people who can use the production line. You have to make the little jars. You have to make the labels. You have to make the lid. You have to have managers. You have to have distribution. You have to have people who can take it to put it on the ship that's going to carry it to trade. You have to have people who make agreements with the places that are going to sell it. You have to have shops that sell it in Haiti. You have to have a whole network of things that happen. And you create jobs and employment and education and training and opportunity. So the point about thinking differently and thinking longer term, in my view, is that it gives you the space to be able to also create the opportunities that can make a difference. But it only works if you also think comprehensively. I used to talk a lot about a comprehensive approach, and people would often not know what I meant. So let me explain it by talking about pirates off the coast of Somalia. When I started my job in 2009, the biggest problem that the European Union faced, and that the world faced really, was piracy off the coast of Somalia. 30,000 ships would cross this particular piece of water off the coast every year, and many of them were ships providing food for the World Food Programme to the poorest people on earth, or would be carrying huge amounts of trade, huge amounts of goods across this particular part of the sea. And the pirates were capable at that point of capturing not only the ships, but also the crews, the people who were on the ships, and holding them to ransom. So they would hold them off the coast, they would keep them under guns, they would not allow them to leave, and they would demand huge amounts of money from the different companies. And this became a really big problem. And the problem was partly solved on the sea by creating corridors, places where if you kept your ship in this particular corridor, you would not be attacked. But what the military teams who were protecting the ships would always say was the answer to piracy was not at sea, it was on the land. It was in Somalia itself, because the pirates were often teenage boys, 15, 16 years old, who had the option of maybe getting a job that would give them $1 a day, or the $10,000 that they would be given if they successfully captured a ship. In other words, they had no future. There was nothing for them. Piracy seemed like an opportunity to at least have some money and be able to leave, if nothing else. If you're going to solve one problem, you have to look at how you do a comprehensive approach to solving it. If we simply captured pirates, put them in prison, let them serve the time that they had to spend in prison and then leave, and all they went back to was the same problem, then we would solve nothing. And that meant thinking about the whole of Somalia, a country that had spent 22 years by that point in civil war, a country that was impossible to govern. When I visited Mogadishu, the government controlled only 1 mile square, 1.5 kilometres square, around the airport. That was it. The rest of the country was controlled by Al-Shabaab, who were the terrorist groups, or was just out of control. And the ability to transform that into a country that was capable of tackling the piracy issue by providing opportunities was an enormous task. But it was only going to succeed if we thought about everything. So that meant jobs, training, schools, a justice system, prisons that allowed for young people to get training and to leave with something that they could do. Voluntary organisations to go and support communities, helping communities develop healthcare centres, working with them to provide employment opportunities, investment back into the country, rebuilding areas that had been destroyed, a whole comprehensive approach. And that meant working with the government of Somalia to achieve that. Because without thinking across a whole nation, whether it's Somalia or Haiti, affected in different ways by crisis and disaster, then all you do is put the sticking plaster on the problem, you don't solve the problem. But to solve the problem takes time. The best thing that I remember from the president of Somalia, who's now again the president of Somalia, was a campaign he ran with young people which was called Give Up Your Guns and Go to School. Because so many young people in Somalia had grown up with a gun, had grown up running wild, grown up seeing the gun as the obvious thing that they should carry, had become part of the armed groups, had been persuaded to become soldiers, if you like, for the terrorists. Getting them back into school, persuading them that education was a solution for them was really important as part of a whole infrastructure of change. So thinking long term means also, in my view, thinking comprehensively. And it brings me on to thinking about the institutions that we now have. And the European Union would be one of those, despite the fact that my country is no longer part of the EU. I hope its relationships with the EU grow stronger over the next period. And I'm particularly interested in what happens in terms of the future and developing the depth and breadth of the European Union, as I am about the depth and breadth of the United Nations, for example. Because in these challenging times when we see what's happening in Europe, with war in Europe, it's important to protect the institutions that we have. And it means thinking about them a bit differently. So I think about them as tankers, a big tanker at sea, or yachts. Let me explain. If you're the United Nations, or the EU, or the African Union, or these organisations that develop not just around one set of ideas, usually economics, but who are working together with values and ideals at the heart of them, who believe in human rights, in democracy, freedom of the press, who support civil societies, who believe in a freedom that we have come to know in Europe, then they are like big tankers. They are difficult to move, but they stay at sea for a long time, and they're big and important, and they keep moving. They keep looking to get to their destination, which is that all their values should exist everywhere. They get knocked off course a bit, but they keep going. And then you have the yachts. And the yachts are when you bring together groups of countries or institutions around one particular problem or issue. So you'll bring together a coalition to support a particular activity or program. The Friends of Syria, when we first began to look at how we could support people within Syria. The coalition around Libya. The bringing together of people who often have very little in common except the issue on which they're working. The biggest example of that for me was what we call the E3+3 or the P5+1, the group that came together to resolve the Iranian nuclear program. To say that we had nothing much in common beyond it proved more true when in the process that we were dealing with Iran, we were also dealing with what was happening in Ukraine when Russia took Crimea and moved into the Donbass. But it worked as a team, as a group, because it had one central mission to achieve, which was to tackle the Iranian nuclear program, to give all of you confidence that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and it wasn't at that time. And it's important to use the yachts and tankers when appropriate. Sometimes you need to bring people together just to tackle one issue. Other times, what makes a big difference is our ability to stand together and to keep moving, even when times are incredibly difficult. And it's incredibly important that as we look at the future, we look after the tankers. We need to scrub off the rust. We need to make sure that they keep moving. We need to make sure that the idea of countries coming together around a common framework continues to exist, even though at times it will seem difficult, especially when we think about the UN at the present time. So I'm going to stop because I want to talk to you and I want to have your questions. But in all that you're thinking as students and your future, I hope that you will especially consider the importance of thinking longer term, comprehensively, protecting those organisations whose job it is to keep moving and to think longer term, and using all of the different instruments, the toolkit of foreign policy and diplomacy to try and achieve that, even though to say now to governments and to people the only way we resolve these issues is to think long term is quite difficult. But if we don't, we know what the consequences are. The consequences are very straightforward. Issues end up with us either way. People's lives are not supported and helped in ways they should be. People suffer when we don't support them. people don't get the future that they deserve, and we end up, in the end, paying more. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for this presentation and for the insistence on the long term and for giving us so many examples that are perhaps not on everyone's mind when one discusses these matters, like Somalia, like some of the other issues you mentioned. I mean, obviously, in the course of your career, you were involved in some of the major building blocks that keep us busy to this day. You mentioned the Iranian deal. Obviously, Serbia and Kosovo come to mind right now. You were present at Euromaidan, which has a dramatic follow-up, a tragic follow-up that the Vice-Rector has already mentioned. So obviously, the long term is important here as well. And on some of these issues, we seem a little bit in a hurry, if I may say so, when it comes to the long term. And there's also the issue that came to my mind when you spoke, where are the yachts today on some of these issues, the tankers you mentioned, but what about the yachts? And then, of course, I think that everybody in this room, when he follows current affairs right now, asks himself the question that you have on the title of your book, and then what? And I'm sure that you can give many answers to some of these issues. So with your permission, I would call some questions here so that we have this discussion and perhaps ask 3 or 4 students at a time to ask some questions so that we can bring them together in a block and that you can then respond. So with this, whom can I, lady in the second row here? And if you could introduce yourself and also say where you're from.
Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. I'm Coralie. I'm a student from Belgium and France. I like this long-term perspective. I really appreciate it. And I will have 2 small questions about that. Is how would you evaluate the EU's long-term strategy towards Moldova and Ukraine over the past 2 decades? And how, from now on, can we imagine a long-term perspective in our relations with Russia now, in like the relations between Europe and Russia from now on? Thank you.
One more question, or would you prefer?
I just want to say, what's really interesting about Poland already is everybody asked 2 questions. I've noticed that everywhere I've gone so far. It's just fascinating.
Okay, perhaps one more question.
No, it's fine. I don't mind.
Second row here, gentleman in the middle. Yes, please.
You can ask 2 as well.
So, my name is Pau. I'm French and Spanish. My question would be around thinking long term. So, you were the first High Representative since the Lisbon Treaty. You led the creation of the External Action Service, but sometimes the figure itself of the High Representative has been deemed as a mission impossible due to its over-encompassing nature of representing interests, but also having a common EU foreign policy, right? Now, thinking long term, do you think that maybe the figure of the High Representative is a mission impossible? And if so, what can be done for that? Thank you.
So one more, and then I think you have lots of questions. Perhaps there at the back. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Hugo. I come only from France, sadly.
Oh, Hugo.
You insisted a lot on the long term, and I'm glad that you mentioned China, which doesn't seem to have elections regularly. And so my question is, how do you combine the political systems that we have mainly in Western Europe, which are democracies, where you have elections held every 4 years or every 5 years, and where you have politicians more interested in tackling short-term issues to satisfy their voters. And I can't resist to, while you're being here, to quote Winston Churchill saying, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried.
So you have China and democracy, the future of Ukraine, and the mission impossible.
So, thinking the long term on Ukraine and on Russia, I've always believed it's important to imagine the world in 20 or 30 years and work backwards. And what we want to ensure is that on the continent of Europe we have peace and security for nations to make their own choices and to live in a strong economic and hopefully political linkage, even if they're not members of the same club. And that has to in some way apply to our thinking about Russia in the longer term. That the best security for Ukraine is to make sure that Russia has no interest, no desire, no leadership that would want to put it in that position to want to invade another country's territory again. And that's not about saying we want regime change, it's about saying what does the relationship need to look like in the longer term. And when you think about longer term issues, it means that when you're working on the crisis of the moment, you've always got in your mind the ultimate objective is to create peace and security on the continent of Europe. So how are we going to do that? What are the things along the way that might take us to a point where we can achieve that? And that's going to be, I think, very important for the future of Ukraine. Because for Ukraine to succeed now, it's really important. It's about the future of Europe as well. And it's about what kind of countries we're going to be living next to and with, and making sure that countries are free to be sovereign states, to make their own choices, which is fundamental. And that takes you in the context to the democracies, that we now have and the direction of travel of the future. Because there's a sense of, well, maybe we're going to see our way of life changed or our way of thinking changed. But when I've traveled all over the world, people fundamentally want the same things. They want peace and security, they want economic prosperity, they want opportunity, but they want to live in societies where they feel free and able to prosper. And I think that's never to be underestimated wherever they are.
Mission Impossible in China.
Mission Impossible. Well, I'll do China first. Where are you? I've lost you. You were quoting, go on. Ask me again about China?
It was about how do you combine setting long-term interests? Because you insist a lot on having vision, like long-term vision. Yeah. But our political systems are designed through the elections. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's one of the challenges, isn't it? I mean, the interesting thing about foreign policy, security policy, defense policy, is that as a generalization along mainstream political thought, it is roughly the same. It's not so different between different mainstream political thinking. There'll be a nuance here and a nuance there, but the basic premise of foreign policy in most countries along the mainstream political parties is the same. So in my country, there is no difference on support for Ukraine. In most countries along the mainstream, there would be very little difference. There might be, some would be more inclined to give more military assistance, some would give a bit less, some would want more diplomacy, whatever. But you generally get the same amongst the political spectrum. So you can think longer term. It's just that we don't. We think in the election cycle, exactly as you say, that governments come in, if they come in for 4 or 5 years, they think about what they will do in that time. And the problem is you can't solve problems across the world in that time frame. You can make a difference, but you can't solve things. You can't really make the long-term differences. So part of what I'm trying to say is that this is about getting the political thinking and the diplomatic thinking that will influence it to think much longer term and to be prepared to put the investment in. And that's quite hard, but it's very important to do it. As for Mission Impossible, well, they gave it to a woman, so it wasn't impossible. Then they gave it to another woman, so it wasn't impossible. And now we've given it to a man. And he already has 2 women's backdrop to work on, so he'll be fine. More seriously, when I started the job, everybody said, oh, it's an impossible job. And it used to annoy me because jobs are not impossible. They are what you make of them. There was a lot to do. We had to build a service. I used to describe it as flying a plane while still screwing the wings on at the same time. But it's really a sense of what you do with it. And the point about bringing together the member states in one common foreign and security policy is really important. And I've said this a couple of times already, but I'll repeat it again because I think it's really important to me that Brussels is the only place in the world where ambassadors and politicians come to find a solution together. And if you're an ambassador or an official, you will have seen to have failed if you don't find a way through, if you simply stay in your own domestic, your own national position. Okay? Nowhere else in the world. It's not true in the UN. I used to bring things back. You'll remember, Thomas, we used to bring things back from the UN to Brussels when we couldn't get the EU countries to agree in the UN. We'd bring it back to Brussels where they would agree because ambassadors and officials knew that in Brussels the job was to get agreement. The job was not to hold out in the end. You might hold out for a while. And the problem is it's all very public. So you hear very easily across the European Union and beyond ministers and ambassadors saying, I am going to tell these other countries what our position is. I am going to give a press conference before I go into the meeting explaining my national position. And that's what you see every time. They're doorstepped by journalists. They say the point that they have, that their most important points as a nation, as a politician, as a government. But inside the room, their job is to find a solution together, and that's what they do. It's not always easy. You've seen that. It's not always easy to work your way through a particular problem, but they do. And that's what makes it very special when you get countries coming together in this particular way, and what makes the High Representative job ultimately possible. There'll be moments when there is a disagreement that can't be resolved, but the direction of travel is always to find solutions. And for me, that meant that you were both trying to lead a little, to get people to think about issues perhaps differently or to find answers, but you were also responding to those issues. And for each country, supporting each other meant that you would be supported on the issues that mattered most to you. So it's not impossible. It's challenging and difficult. It's not impossible. And Joseph, you're doing it just as well as we did, even though you're a bloke and a man.
Thank you. I think we can take a second group, the lady there in the middle.
Shall I come over here?
No, it's okay. It's okay. From there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ashton. Your speech really...
If you could, I know who you are, but if you could introduce yourself, it would
Sorry?
be nice. If you could introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Simay and I come from Turkey. I have again 2 questions, but it will be... Yeah, it will be really short. It will be not political and so forth. It's about maybe me and maybe other women who want to be like you in the future. So I'm a Turkish woman, and I mean, women are striving hard, working hard as twice as men. And in times of crisis, you talked about the mission impossible, and you said nothing is impossible. How did you find your impossible? And during the times of crisis, as a woman, you know, surrounded by men, all men, how did you find your motivation? And other than thinking long term, if you could give one advice to all of us, not just women, what would it be? Thank you.
Okay. We'll do that immediately, perhaps, yes.
So, one of the things that is really important about negotiation, foreign policy, diplomacy, is that it's men and women working together. You can't do good diplomacy with 50% of the population missing. Okay? It's the combination that is so successful. It's what made it work in the Iran negotiations. We had men and women working together on our side who were bringing to it their experiences and knowledge and just who they were. So never underestimate the importance of both. But sometimes for women it's also incredibly important because we play a role perhaps slightly differently. And certainly with Serbia and Kosovo, I think being a woman in those circumstances at that time with those particular politicians was probably an advantage. I think sometimes I looked like I was their disappointed mother. But there are ways in which we approach problems and solutions based on our own experiences. It's not better or worse than men, it's just different. And it's pulling it together in a team that makes a big difference. When I began as High Representative, I chaired my first Foreign Affairs Council. I was really nervous, as you would expect. And I looked around the room, and it was 27 foreign ministers before Croatia joined, and they were all men. And one of them, Alex Stubb, who was then the Finnish foreign minister, shouted out to me, "Kathy, what's it like being the only woman in the room?" And I said, "It doesn't matter, I'm in charge." The point being as well that you have to take control of the situation that you're in and be determined about what you want. So my advice to everybody is decide what it is you're trying to do and stick at it. Keep going, you know. There'll be lots of times on the way when it all goes wrong, when people are horrible to you, when you don't think you can achieve it. And particularly if you end up doing something that has an international or a national impact, it's really sometimes very challenging to think how much rests on you or feels like it rests on you. But you have to keep going. You have to believe in yourself and you have to believe in what it is you're trying to do. And the things that we value, the ideals we stand up for, well, they're just worth fighting for every single day. And that should keep you motivated to try and do your very best and achieve what you can. It's a really imperfect world. People are imperfect. You deal with all sorts of extraordinary, wonderful people, and you deal with some really difficult people you'd rather not be in the room with. You'd rather see them in jail. But you deal with it and you keep going.
Thank you. Yes, there at the back. Yes.
Honorable Lady Catherine ASHTON, thank you very much for your inspiring speech.
Could you also introduce yourself a second?
Of course. My name is Anna, and I'm coming from Armenia. And I have a question regarding to the European Union's current active and promising involvement in the Eastern Partnership, particularly the South Caucasus, namely President Charles Michel trying to create a dialogue between the conflicted sides of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And we also know that today there is the blockade of the Lachin corridor, which is the only lifeline connecting Karabakh Armenians to the outer world. And we also know that the European Court of Justice ordered Azerbaijan to immediately open the road. However, it's already more than 100 days, the blockade is still going on. And we also know that many people think that and assume that it's because of the gas deal between Azerbaijan and the European Union that European Union is not taking drastic measures. And however, I think that it's actually not the...
Could you just get to your question?
Yeah, I will, of course I will. So And some people think that it's the dependency on the Azerbaijani gas that makes European Union to become independent. But on the other hand, I'm thinking it's the dependency of the Azerbaijan on the European Union as a basic and a major gas importer. And hence, my question to you is, why do you think European Union doesn't use the gas deal as a conditionality to urge Azerbaijan to comply with the order of the European Court of Justice? Thank you for your attention.
It's a question that you'd have to ask those in power in the European Union. I learned a long time ago that what you don't need are people who've left office trying to second guess why people do things who are in office. What I can tell you is I think Charles Michel is genuinely committed to try and find a way that Europe can support a solution in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it was, when I visited Armenia and Azerbaijan, it was very clear years ago that this was a significant problem that you could see solutions to. And we had peace talks ongoing, but there wasn't an obvious moment when either side was prepared to find an answer. Sometimes one side would say, well, we could do it this way, or the other, but never together. And I think, and I hope that what they're doing now is going to be significant. Now, your particular point about why not use one piece of leverage, I would be surprised if people are not thinking about that. What they decide to do is for them, because as I say, when you leave office, one of the things you have to do is leave.
Thank you very much.
Yes, there at the back. Yeah. And I'll perhaps take two, if you don't mind. Two questions, is that okay?
Lady Ashton, thank you so much for being here.
You can call me Kathy, by the way. You don't have to do the
I prefer the lady. And my best wishes for the upcoming release of your book. My question is related to your time back in office as High Representative of the European Union. And you were...
You also, could you kindly introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm Yanis and I'm from Greece. And my question is related, as I said, to the period between 2009 and 2014, that you were the High Representative of the EU. We're talking about a period that was really, that the EU was really hit by the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, that had created tension between the EU member states and especially the division between North and the South. And my question is, as you were the High Representative of the EU back then, how your office and your work was really affected that period by the financial crisis and by the division? Was it easy for you to battle the differences and to coordinate in the aspect of foreign policy, or it was much more difficult in the years that were passing by as the tension was getting higher and higher between EU member states? Thank you.
Perhaps one more question. Yes, here, a gentleman from Serbia.
Hello, my name is Elvir. I'm coming from Serbia and Kosovo, so both of the countries. And I have like two simple and short questions. And like the first question is, how did this long-term thinking help you with resolving the issue with Serbia and Kosovo? And the second question is, what do you think about the Open Balkan initiative? Thank you very much.
Gosh, you go all over the place. It's wonderful. So, Yanis, first of all, so in terms of the financial crisis, the biggest challenge was that there wasn't the resource available to set up the service as well as we would have liked. And you really felt that it was very difficult to look for new resources from European Union countries or from the institutions, because the big focus was on supporting the economies, not least of Greece. And George Papandreou was the Prime Minister at the time, who was incredibly supportive of what we were doing in the EAS, even though obviously he was grappling with the challenges that Greece was facing. So that was the biggest, I think, issue. And it made us create a service that really did try to stick within the existing resources brought together, not ask for new resources. And that had an impact. It meant we couldn't open delegations in places I would like to have done, like the Gulf countries, where we only had one at that point. nor indeed to have things like secure communications and different aspects of the way in which a foreign service would normally run. We had to be careful and cautious about building slowly, so we didn't look for new resources because it wasn't forthcoming. I think for some countries, they wondered probably whether this was a moment to create something so new as an external action service, and that I understood as well. So we were very mindful of the position that countries were in. Perhaps in terms of the effect on foreign and security policy, it's probably a bit about our relationship with China, because many countries were looking to China in terms of investment, in terms of helping to ease the crisis, and China was very important in terms of the euro at that point. So you saw a lot more activity with China from individual countries as well as from the EU than you might perhaps have expected when you look now at what attention is given to China in terms of visits and so on. And so that was a big part of what I was watching, was making sure that we didn't split off our different views with China to the point where you couldn't have had an EU strategy towards China. So that was probably the country I noticed had the most visits at that time that were to do with the economies of individual nations. Serbia, Kosovo. Do I think long term? Well, I'm still engaged with both of them. So yes, I'm still at it all these years later. And I think the only way to consider the future for Serbia and Kosovo is to think longer term. When we did the Brussels agreement, it wasn't a solution, it was a beginning. And it was important because until the two prime ministers walked into my office, they had never met. They were the same age, but they had never met. And it was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, to actually come into the room and be together, for obvious reasons, because Serbia didn't recognize Kosovo, and because for Kosovo to sit with Serbia was unthinkable at that point. So it was really brave of the two of them to do that, and I've always paid tribute to both sides for the willingness that they had from different politicians to try and find a way through, recognizing the red lines they had. Kosovo is a country, Serbia will not recognize the red line we bumped up against all the time but did not cross. And in the context of now and the agreements that they're looking to, I have huge admiration for Miroslav Lajcek. He used to work with me. We are still great friends and I'm still supporting him. And he's asked me if I will help on trying to move forward the relationship again, and of course I will. But it's important that both realize that getting to the EU is where they need to get to, that it will become more difficult because the challenges inside both will grow, and the challenges inside both not to have a relationship with each other have always been present, but of course will be used by others to create more problems. So I hope we'll see a lot of movement, not just towards the EU, but also towards each other, and finally both inside the EU.
Thank you. I think if, with your permission, we can take two more questions, if that is fine. Yes, there in the middle. Colleague from Denmark. If
Hello, hello. Hi, Kathy. My name is Magnus. I'm from Denmark, and my good colleagues already asked about some of these sort of the structural disadvantages of the European Union, and you yourself have mentioned the sort of the impossible character of being the HRVP. And so I wanted to ask a bit blunt question: if you got to hold the pen yourself and completely draw up the new treaties of the European Union, what qualities would they have that the current treaties don't hold? Thank you.
Okay. Blimey, that's a hard question.
And a colleague from the UK.
Hello, Kathy. My name is Otto. Not only am I from the same country as you, but my dad is from the same county as you. Lancaster. And so one of the questions I would have, you've spoken a lot about the importance of a sort of long-term strategy, and you've also talked about the sort of the values of yachts versus tankers. And you've talked about the sort of the changing nature of European institutions. What do you, and you also talked about staying away from things that you've already left, but one area where you very much haven't left is the British Parliament and your position in the Labour Party in terms of setting sort of a future agenda for like Labour's policy on the European Union. What do you see as sort of the long-term strategy that Britain can have towards the European Union in terms of building a sort of more constructive future relationship? Thank you.
If I may, I will perhaps add one final question from my side, and that is, I know how much you have invested into the transatlantic relationship over your term in office, and you said that policies don't change when governments change normally. I just wanted to know whether you think that is also true of the United States.
I know what you're thinking of. Yes. So, if I could do the treaty, what would I have in it? What would I make different? I do think the institutions which were created in the 60s and 70s, if the European Union gets any bigger, they'll need to think about how those work more effectively. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that it will be important to consider what they ought to look like. I would hope that the treaties would be very clear about the Western Balkans coming in to the European Union, because although it's been a kind of agreed policy, it does wobble about a bit, and I'd like that to be absolutely clear. And I think we can add into that what the future of Ukraine in the European Union, bringing that into the EU, which was not a settled policy until this dreadful war broke out, but now is, which is great. But I think I would want to see not just the internal thinking, but also thinking more broadly about relations outside. So that would include the Eastern Partnership countries too. And I suppose within the EU, I would like to see a stronger emphasis on making sure that what we believe to be the core values remain the core values. So you can never ever say too often that democracy matters, human rights matters, freedom of the press matters, judicial independence matters. All of the cornerstones, the things that really make a difference, need to be reflected again and again, because we take them for granted, and I think treaties have to put those things in. Whether they do about voting rights and stuff, I don't care, frankly. I think it's really important that everybody signs up to the importance of what the European Union stands for. Where did we go next? We went the future of the UK, Otto, and then we come on to transatlantic and President Trump, which is what you're thinking of. So Otto, I'm glad your dad comes from Lancashire. Say hello for me. I think what we have just seen in what Rishi Sunak has done with Northern Ireland, and the fact that Maros Sefcovic was in London smiling, shaking hands and moving forward is really important, because it's the first real signal of the UK finding its relationship with Europe and with the EU in particular. What I hope is we'll build on that. If there is a change of government, in a way it's easier because the Conservatives were the ones who took us to Brexit and created the circumstances. So for Labour coming in, they're not carrying that burden, and it is led by someone who was very clearly pro-Europe. I don't think we'll see Britain back in the European Union anytime soon, but I would expect to see much stronger economic relations, because our economy needs help and we need to work together on that. And I think we will see much stronger foreign and security policy. I never understood why that wasn't kept, because it's so obvious that there is a natural way in which we should be working on all of these issues together. So I hope what you'll see is the huge gap narrowing, and us working much more closely in the future. And the transatlantic relationship, well, we did have a different president with a different approach. And I think we all could write many essays on the subject of what that meant in the transatlantic relationship. But what also was the case was that underneath that, a lot of the relationships remained strong. The relationship between Congress and the European Parliament and individual nations remained strong. I spent quite a lot of time talking with officials from that administration, and the relationships across the Atlantic to Britain, but also to Europe, were incredibly important to them as well. So it doesn't always follow that even when you see someone who has a very different view, that what's going on, the underpinning gets taken away. It might have been different had he had 2 terms in office, because I think his view of NATO and of Europe was very transactional. What do we get out of it? Without understanding all of the different ways in which you could describe what the US got out of it. But I do think that we've moved back into a period when the relationship is much stronger, as we've seen from Joe Biden and his approach to Europe in particular.
Well, thank you very much. You've given us lots of answers on the long term. I think a lot of matter to think about. And above all, you've answered this in a manner that gives us hope and optimism, I have to say. And thank you for that as well. And thank you for coming.
Dear students, can I ask you to remain seated until our guest, Lady Ashton, has left the room, so then we can move smoothly upstairs because she has an interview here. Thank you.